Hello, everyone, and welcome to the class online. So, this lecture is going to be actually covering the reading that we did on Monday, which was on Judith Lorber's classic text, The Social Construction of Gender. So, this one will walk you through the text and will lead you very well into the next lecture, which is on gender performance and performativity. Why do we still teach this? Why do we still teach the social construction of gender? One is that it is a very important text, both within feminist and women's studies, in the way of articulating how gender is so pervasive in our society that something as simple as legs, like legs are the same for regardless of whatever gender you were assigned to at birth or whatever gender or spectrum in that you identify with now. Yet, we make a very big deal about how legs should be presented, what things can be worn, if the leg is shaved or not. And really, the only thing that is determining that is gender. So, something as stupid and simple as legs has a lot of gender politics around it. And it speaks to just how pervasive gender is, that something that should have nothing to do with gender, a leg, which is more about getting you to one place to the next, is overly determined by gender. So, in her text, Judith Lorber talks about how talking about gender for most people is the equivalent of a fish talking about water. And what she means by that is that gender is so pervasive that in our society we assume that it's bred into our genes, that it's something that is always has been, always will be, and continue forever. And therefore, most people find it hard to believe that gender is constantly created and recreated out of human interaction, one-to-one daily interactions, right? And we have multiple interactions, both in the physical present, but also, as I'll talk a little bit later, on the online social media present as well. But also it comes out of our social life and is the texture and order of that social life. It really does define so much of how we can move about in this world. Yet, like gender, like culture, it is a human production that depends on everyone doing it. So it's not just the select few people who are coming around, I don't know, in a equivalent of a police car, monitoring our gender behavior. But in fact, all of us are doing it anyways, and then we're kind of, we're interacting with each other, we're checking each other out, we're also checking each other in the sense of disciplining each other in subtle and not so subtle ways on our gender. Now we're going to backtrack just a little bit to get into our next conversation around biology and gender. I am guilty of this as many other instructors, in that, when I first talk about gender to students, particularly students who've never really talked about gender that much, oftentimes we do the shortcut of, okay, sex refers, to biology or anatomy or physiology, right? DNA, right? But gender refers to the range of characteristics pertaining to and differentiating between masculinity and femininity. And we do this as a way to get students to start thinking about gender as not something that is naturally connected or innate to, physical, physiology, right? Genitals, essentially, and so forth. But this sort of distinction between sex and gender is something that we should also challenge because, as I'm going to talk about in our next slides, there's no biological base to gender. And in fact, this differentiation between male sex and female sex is a lot more complicated. But before I go into that conversation, I do want to make a point that in my lecture today and also our discussions for this week is very much based on a Western assumption around gender, which is very much dependent upon an idea of a binary gender system, right? Two genders, male and female. And many other societies, both outside of the West, but also here in the United States, do not follow this model and have never been following this model. For example, Native Americans. Some Native American communities, groups, have. It wouldn't be appropriate to say a third gender category because that's not technically correct. So I would just say that there's space for other articulations around gender. And one is two spirit, which is neither male nor female, but is much more connected to spiritualism. And, two spirit persons are very important within many Native American communities. They serve as spiritual leaders and community leaders as well. But getting back to this idea that gender is based on biology, I want to see, and if we were in a class, I would be asking you this question, what are the physical, biological characteristics or attributes that we attach to being a man in America? Likewise, what are the physical, biological attributes that we attach to being a woman in America? And I think a lot of us could state a couple things, right? Men are supposed to be very muscular, very strong, maybe even very athletic, naturally athletic, and great at athletics, right? They should have muscles. They maybe are hairy, right? They might have very broad shoulders or very large hands, except for Donald Trump. Okay. Women, right? So women should not have too much muscle mass. Again, these are popular definitions, right? Or they should be very curvy, or soft in the sense of, I guess, soft both in skin and I guess in squishiness. I'm not sure. Women should maybe be shorter, so not too tall. Women should not have hair, right? Be completely hairless by some magical intervention, and so forth. I think all of us can talk about this. And of course, I know that, the sort of the physical, biological sort of ideal attributes that we put onto people do vary across cultures here, even here in the United States, in communities in the United States. But I think we can, but one thing that whatever variations there are, like, that there are distinct ideas of what men should look like both physically, but also, this idea that biologically they should look like that, and women should look like in a certain way and so forth. And it's very distinct and very different. The reason why I asked that question is it gets me to start thinking about a conversation that I had many years ago with one of my really dear friends, who's a gay cisgendered man. And, I think would identify as being a feminist. He's very much about, like, women should have equal access to work, education, and so forth. But of course, there's always those, like, late night conversations and over a beer or whatever where they go, well, maybe. And so this is one of the moments where my friend and I were talking, and, because what else do you talk to a women's studies professor about but, I guess, women's rights? And he said, I totally agree in equal opportunities, but he's like, but what about the instances where women cannot physically do the job? And I was like, what do you mean women can't physically do the job? He's like, well, like, what about, like, working on an oil rig? Where, that's a really physically demanding job, it's super dangerous. And, I mean, a woman couldn't be able to, again, this person knows nothing about being on oil rig, so there you have it right there. But, saying like, oh, a woman couldn't, be able to like work the equipment or pick up heavy pipes and so forth, right? And essentially, you could use this for another example, like construction work or even law enforcement and so forth, that women could not physically handle the job. Which is always sort of like, okay, well, what about, I don't know. It's very interesting because one is that there are many women who actually work on these oil rigs. So right there and then his argument about, well, women really can't do this job is like, well, there are women doing that job. So next, but it does get to this question around, how even, people who I think that my friend is a feminist and somebody who definitely thinks about and advocates for equality and equal access and so forth, still has, idea around, so sort of these biological assumptions and limitations of both men and women, that they couldn't do something based on, biologically they're just not equipped for it. So the example of the oil rig gets to a larger question on how we assume so much about individuals' capabilities, capacities, and so forth, and both physical strength, but also we can equate that to also mental and so forth. Based on this idea of biological differentiation, that we think that, men and women, yes, with all good intentions everything should be equal, but they are very different. And I think, one of the problems is that we, normalize, or we sort of reduce the wide variety of people, right? Just people in general, people's different body shapes, capabilities, disabilities, and so forth. And instead, we sink it down to two models, male and female, and we have kind of ideals, around what is a man and what is a woman, and what is capable and what is not capable, and not actually looking at the wide variety that there is. For example, here's a photo of Olympic athletes, champions actually. Many of them won many gold medals from, I believe this was like the London Olympics. So this is about, oh gosh, now it's going to be about 8 years ago. Now, admittedly, these female athletes are already exceptional, right? Like these are people who are at the top of their game, right? And especially top of their game for their chosen field of athleticism, right? And their bodies they have not only shaped their bodies themselves, but they of course were born with some sort of, maybe some natural talent for that specific job, but of course they've worked very hard for it. But one thing that you notice, besides the fact that everybody looks like that they swam in olive oil, is the wide variety of bodies, right? You have somebody who's very, very tiny, who's, like the gymnasts, which again, that's kind of how they're so good at being in gymnastics too. The basketball players being super tall, to the weightlifters being much more larger. And all this sort of says is that, and here's another example, again, of female athletes in the London Olympics, is that yes, on one hand, these people are exceptional and are outside of the norm anyways, right? Because these are people who are training their entire life for this sport. But what I also hoped that you see in these photos is just the wide variation of bodies under the category of female. And I can guarantee you that many women that are being shown here could have easily worked on that oil rig, right? Could have easily done outmatched, outpunched, outrun, outdone anything with many men, probably the majority of men in the world, right? Because these are top athletes in their field. But yet, we forget this variety. We forget this sort of, range of bodies. And instead, we think of one model of what it should be, a woman and her capabilities. Because the same variety is also seen in men, where you have, again, this is a picture of male athletes in the London Olympics, and you just see, again, the wide variety of bodies, body sizes, body shapes, and so forth, To the point where, can we even talk about an average size, shape, or type of male athlete? Because it really doesn't exist. Yet, we still sort of support this myth around biological differentiation that does not actually exist. So, that whole thing that I talked about sex being biological and gender being social, the truth is that even scientists nowadays talk about sex in a much more nuanced way. That, first of all, there's incredible amounts of variety between genders and within genders, and that in fact that there's more genetic differentiations within a sex, so within the female sex, if you want to say, and within the male sex, is what much more variety than there is differences between men and women, because besides for a couple of key, maybe some parts that you know which mostly are reproductive parts, the biological differences between men and women are not there, right? Same brain, same heart, same lungs, same legs with hair, because both have hair, right? And also, very importantly, is that no person is born 100% genetically or physiologically male or female. Like, there isn't. There is a range of expression, both with anatomy, but also when you look at genes and so forth. And, and what makes us, male or female should not be based on, genitals, because in fact genitals don't really tell us that much. Yes, they can tell you about possible reproductive capabilities you might have, but actually, around your, how much testosterone you get, estrogen you get, and then also, again, all with your genetics and DNA, genitals really don't tell you that much. And in fact, it's really about how a person experiences themselves and wants to express themselves in whatever way they want to, that really tells you about a gender. So that all gets to say that there is no such thing as a biologically based gender. Yet, obviously, we've built up an entire society based on this myth. So, getting the myth of biology out of the way, why do we hold on to gender so much? And not only in the way that we think about how gender is naturally occurring and happens organically, but also the way that we have as feminists made very shortcuts around gender. We have also made some very, I think, misguided gender assumptions, particularly when we talk about patriarchy, male violence against women, misogyny, that too often we equate what are systems of gender inequality to that men are naturally aggressive or naturally predatory, and women are, I guess, victims, or are being controlled by men. And I have seen this even within my own activism work, that too often these shortcuts, not only rely on these not true ideas around biology, that boys are naturally aggressive or violent and girls are not, but actually work to then not really address the real issues around inequality in the room, but also work to not have bridges between men and women around fighting against gender inequality, which they both suffer from, as well as further could be causing more harm and damage to men, especially little boys. And that's where Judith Lorber's book or article comes into play and has made such an impact within the feminist movement, because it challenges us to not think about gender in these biological terms, but instead think about how we are all implicated in constructing gender. So the article that you read, that you're going to be reading at the beginning of the week, is The Social Construction of Gender. It came out in 1994. Judith Orber was already writing a lot of stuff around the social construction of gender, but this one is considered a seminal text. It really articulated a lot of the thoughts that feminists were starting to, discuss around gender, around, not basing it on biology, not basing it on this gender binary, but instead thinking about how all of us, regardless of whatever gender you identify with, are implicated in maintaining, reinforcing, and creating gender norms, rules, as well as the power structures in play to create a gender hierarchy. So, three key points that she makes in this article, and there's many other points, and she gives really great examples. But three key sort of takeaways from the article are is that gender is a human production, which is dependent upon everyone constantly, as she quotes, doing gender. Gender is also maintained as a process, as a part of a stratified and structured system. And then lastly, gender inequality is produced and maintained by identifiable social processes and built into the general social structure and individual identities. Let's break this down a bit more, and let's first talk about the ideology of gender. Again, the so-called natural differences, this myth around biology between genders, have been used to justify unequal opportunities in education, employment, politics, and more. Our ideas around gender are more rooted in our social construction of what is natural than in biological limitations. The ideology of gender contains the norms and rules regarding appropriate behavior and determines attributes. It also reproduces a range of beliefs and customs to support these norms and social rules. So, the ideology of gender determines what is expected of us, what is allowed of us, and what is valued in us. So, the ideology of gender, again, what is expected of us, what is allowed of us, what is valued in us. It determines the nature and extent of both disadvantages that men and women might face, disparity, and very importantly, discrimination. And it can be found in the way of roles, as we talked about last week, around what women and men and everyone in the gender spectrum do or must perform. Relations, how men and women, and again, everyone in the gender spectrum relate to one another, interact with one another, what is appropriate, what is not appropriate, what do we have to take, what do women have to accept sometimes, what do men have to accept sometimes. And then identity, how women, men, and everyone in the gender spectrum perceive themselves. So this ideology of gender saturates everything. It saturates, both of how we interact with one another, but also how we feel that we have to perform certain things. And then it relates to how we identify as ourselves. The ideology of gender is created by doing gender. So, doing gender is the idea that gender, rather than an innate quality of individuals, right? You're born a woman, right? Etc., is a psychologically ingrained social construct that actively surfaces in everyday human interactions. And doing gender, because we're all doing gender, depends on gender being, again, this idea that gender is supposed to be innate, biological, and so forth. So again, we're not even thinking about that we're doing gender. We think that this is just how naturally we're going to be, right? That naturally I'm a girl, so I'm not going to be really a good, let's say, an athlete, because, that's not really my forte. Or, I'm a girl and you know what? Girls aren't that great at math, so I'm not going to challenge myself in my math classes and just be like, well, that's not for me. Examples like that, right? Because already we are thinking about gender as something that is already embedded in us. That the minute that I learn that I am a girl, from my parents, from my society all around me, already I'm building a script about what I can do and what I can't do. And I don't even think about the fact that this is a script that is based on nothing. It also depends on enforcing and cementing the gender binary, right? And that happens in a multitude of ways, from our parents to our friends to TV that we watch to education, of course. There's so many ways that we are taught about not only what our gender, what is expected from us as our gender, and what is our capabilities, because again, we believe in this myth of biology around gender, but that then also it's not only that, like, okay, as a girl, I can only do certain things, or I feel like I can only do these certain things, and I believe that I can only do these certain things, even though it's not based in reality, but that boys are going to be very different. That boys are very different from me. Again, this idea that there's an us versus them, that there's such a strong middle line. In reality, there's no line to begin with, but we have created this idea of not only that gender is innate and biological, but that there's a strong separation between the genders. So this strict division is then seen as normal, instead of like, well, a boy is just me, right? Maybe something a little bit different happening in his underpants, but who cares, because that's his business and I have my business. But instead, I think of him as almost like a completely different person, like almost like a completely different species than myself. And that's normal. Again, like, we've heard about like these like self-help books, like men are from Mars and women are from Venus, as if they're like two alien species instead of just, I don't know, humans. But again, we think that it's normal, and we don't even question it. But this idea of normal in itself, is socially constructed. And that gets into gender as performance, which Lorber talks about, which we will definitely talk about how queer theory has taken upon gender as performance and has built it out and talked about it in other ways. But Lorber talks about gender as a performance, that instead of gender being, again, innate and natural, this myth of biology, that we are constantly performing our gender. And it compromises, it comprises pretty much all aspects of our lives, to the point that we don't even think about it. We don't even realize that we are performing it. Yet, we definitely know when we haven't performed it correctly. And that's where we get sort of clogged on our gender fails. To think about this in a little, gender performance in a way that, we all kind of are exposed to it. Think about the way that we perform or do gender. We are doing gender on social media. So there are, if you Google Instagram poses, first of all, it seems that the market's really only for women, because when you Google Instagram poses, there's a lot of images like this of like how to, for women to, I guess, maximize their breasts, make their abdomens look smaller, make their butts look bigger. There's like hundreds of these photos, and in fact, this one is a lot more demure than the ones that you can do when you Google it. But here, so on one hand, you can be like, well, it's just about ideal beauty standards, right? And men surely must do this as well. And yes, men do it. Of course, men are also just as, wanting to look attractive as women. But there are different gender poses, right? And there's this really funny thread around men doing women's poses on Instagram, basically copying a woman's Instagram photo and doing it themselves. And we think it's funny because, again, we think about gender in such a binary fashion that we think like, well, only women can do this or so forth. What if a man came out of the shower looking and he thinks, what, I look really cute, take a photo. Or maybe a man wants to accentuate his butt because he probably has a very nice butt, or do the duck face, right? Yet we think this is very funny. The minute that it crosses over, we think it's very funny. But these images and examples are just to sort of show how something this kind of stupid as Instagram, which again, we're all doing it. So I'm not saying that we're stupid for doing it, but it doesn't have that much consequences. We are also, Instagram is not devoid of gender. It's not devoid from us performing gender, even in a space where we're not actually technically interacting with people one to one physically. Yet, we are very much doing gender on Instagram. This gets into talking about how we are all doing gender, even in ways that we don't even think that we are. Even in circumstances where technically we're not even speaking to somebody one to one, like in a room looking at each other. But in fact, we are interacting with each other through an online environment. Because social media, whether that's Instagram, Facebook, or whatever, it's more than just showing what you ate or your cats. And probably you guys have much more interesting Facebook, Instagram posts than me, which is mostly about what I ate and my cats. But, anyways, it is also about doing gender, especially how we are all performing gender on social media. And in this study, they looked at just Facebook photos, Instagram photos, men and women. And here's what they noticed: one, that girls tend to take cute photographs that are often filtered and angled to appear slimmer, lighter, and more quote unquote feminine. Whereas boys, oftentimes in their Instagram photos, take a self promotion photo. Well, where it's not about looking slimmer or lighter, but instead looking at strength or a tough or bad boy behavior. Girls also, so even, okay, so there's the photo end, right? But even then, just like the media, the content that you post about, girls tend to post about friends and family, highlighting their sweet and friendly nature. Boys tend to post about material wealth or sexual prowess, highlighting their gains and abilities. There's so many photos of boys like posing in front of like new shoes or new cars or whatever. And we can sort of laugh about this and be like, okay, well, all right, I see. We're both doing gender, and it's both ridiculous because there are these sort of heightened expectations of what is okay and what is not okay. But the truth is that because we enforce such a strict gender binary, right? Girls need to post these things and look this way, where boys need to post these things and look this way, that anybody who steps out of that rigid definition, a girl who poses in front of a car or is shown weightlifting, is now called, terrible slurs or unmanly. A boy who shows does an Instagram pose of that highlights his butt is laughed at, or is has derogatory slurs thrown at him. And then comes to no surprise that many queer, trans, and non-binary individuals are oftentimes very much attacked on these social media sites, because a lot of it is because the threats that they give to our ideas around gender. And anybody who steps out of the very limited frame of this gender binary. So it's really important that, okay, so we're talking about doing gender, right? And we're talking about how we govern each other and we're all kind of performing. And it can feel a little bit abstract in some ways, or that there aren't real consequences to it. But there are, right? Because as Lorber talks about in his article, that it's not just about doing gender, but also how then do these sort of ideas around gender, the ideology around gender, the way that we perform and check each other on gender creates a stratification system. And as part of a gendered stratification system, gender ranks men above women of, again, in any sort of racial class group. Men are ranked higher than women. And then, therefore, then in a gender stratified society, men's actions are more valued than women's, just because they are done by men, even when their actions may be the same. Lorber's sort of explanation around doing gender and that how that leads to the structures around gender inequality, gender stratification, misogyny, violence against women, the devaluing of femininity in women, helps us to understand why patriarchy has maintained a hierarchy over women in the majority of the world. And that it's not just that biologically men are superior than women, or that biologically men are more aggressive or dangerous to threat to women, but instead it's the system of gender that we have created, that we do in our, to the smallest and stupidest interactions on Instagram, to having real consequences where a woman is denied a job or is experience sexual harassment and violence, and it gets dismissed because women are seen to be, targets, and are always blamed, to violence against anybody who steps outside of the strict gender binary rules, right? That doing gender is more than just about our day-to-day interactions. It's more just about that, oh, I didn't shave my legs, I guess I failed as a woman for not doing gender, but instead has real social consequences on how a person's life can be lived. Really, what is their horizon? How far can they go? How far do they think they can go? And then also the limitations that are put in front of them that can stop them from going to where they want to go, or even going to places that they didn't even expect they could go. And very importantly, it's we are all implicated in this. And that's a really big contribution of Lorber's work into the feminist and women's studies, thinking about it, that it's not just that men are the enemies, because men aren't the enemies. Men are also victims to doing gender and face many limitations because of these strict gender binaries, and face as many limitations, I think, I would argue, as women do. But all of us are implicated in this. Feminists and people who don't identify as being feminist are implicated in this. Because as a social construction, it takes society to maintain it. And as we are all part of society, we are all responsible for it. And it is a direct challenge to not only feminist activists like myself to think about the way that maybe I go about in my politics or articulate issues, but also a challenge in the way that we might want to parent, the way that we make assumptions about people, the way that we might govern other people's behaviors, not even knowing that we're doing this, like we're not even conscious of it anymore. So the social construction of gender, again, talking about gender is like a fish talking about water. They swim in it, they poop in it, they breathe in it, right? It's everywhere. And that is a key contribution to Lorber's work, and a key contribution of the feminist movement and feminist studies, women's studies, in our ideas around gender. But it's more than just doing gender, right? It's more than just pointing out the day-to-day interactions, which are, again, a key contribution, but also the ways that many individuals willingly, consciously understand performance of gender, and the ways that we can still subvert it, still challenge it. And that again, gender, as what Lorber said, was a performance, right? We're performing our gender without knowing it. But maybe exploring that even deeper, that about how gender is always not only just a performance, but a conscious performance, something that we know that we're doing, and maybe in some ways that we can use to challenge. And that's what we're going to be talking about in our next lecture, which is around gender performance, and going to talk a lot more about Judith Butler, who unfortunately we're not actually reading any of her pieces this week because it's just a little bit too complicated. But I will be covering key points of her arguments around gender performance. And that will lead us also into this week's assignment, where we are going to be watching Paris is Burning and Mean Girls and talking about gender as a performance.